Lee Van Cleef was born Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. on January 9, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey, during the tough times of the Great Depression. From a young age, he exhibited a strong sense of independence and discipline, qualities that would shape both his personal life and his acting career. Van Cleef enlisted in the United States Navy during World War II, a decision that deeply impacted his outlook on life. His military service taught him the value of resilience, structure, and duty, lessons that would later be reflected in his tough, stoic, on-screen characters. After the war, Van Cleef set his sights on acting, honing his craft and preparing for the long journey ahead. His first film appearance came in 1952 in High Noon, where he played a small but unforgettable role, setting the stage for his future in Hollywood. Struggling to find recognition. While Lee Van Cleef's early film career began with small roles, he quickly became known for his striking face and intense presence. His unconventional looks, sharp features, and a penetrating gaze often landed him roles as outlaws, henchmen, or secondary villains. Throughout the 1950s, he worked in dozens of westerns and television series, including The Lone Ranger, Gunsmoke, and Have Gun, Will Travel. Though often relegated to secondary roles, Van Cleef showcased his ability to convey menace and intelligence with minimal dialogue, relying on his posture, timing, and expression rather than dramatic theatrics. Despite steady work, Hollywood had yet to recognize the full extent of his talent. Yet these formative years were essential, teaching him the value of persistence and quiet professionalism. The setback and a new direction. In 1958, Van Cleef's career was temporarily derailed by a serious car accident, which caused a significant setback in his journey. However, rather than letting this define him, Van Cleef saw it as a turning point. While opportunities in American cinema became scarce in the 1960s, he found new life in Europe, especially in Italy, where filmmakers were experimenting with darker themes and morally complex characters in the Western genre. It was here that Van Cleef began his iconic collaboration with director Sergio Leone. His performance as Colonel Douglas Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More, 1965, marked a transformative moment in his career, allowing him to emerge as a leading man. Unlike the one-dimensional villains of his early roles, Mortimer was a complex character driven by personal loss and a moral code, showcasing Van Cleef's depth as an actor. Rise to stardom in spaghetti westerns. Lee Van Cleef's career reached new heights as he continued to work with Italian filmmakers, cementing his status as a star in the spaghetti western genre. His roles in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, Day of Anger, 1967, and The Big Gun Down, 1966, further solidified his place in cinematic history. In these films, Van Cleef often played morally ambiguous characters, men caught in the gray area between justice and revenge. His performances resonated with audiences because they felt real and lived in, as he conveyed strength and authority through restraint rather than bombastic violence or heroism. These roles allowed him to demonstrate a compelling mix of vulnerability and menace, making his characters unforgettable. Van Cleef had found his niche, and his work in the genre would define his legacy. Lee Van Cleef's professionalism and integrity. Lee Van Cleef was known not just for his commanding screen presence, but for his professionalism and integrity. Off-screen, he was described as quiet, disciplined, and courteous, a man who took his craft seriously. He was not interested in fame for its own sake, but was instead driven by a deep respect for acting as an art form. Despite the long, hard years of struggling to find recognition, Van Cleef maintained a level of humility that endeared him to his colleagues. He never lost sight of the hard work it took to get to where he was. This professionalism earned him the respect of his peers and ensured that his performances continued to shine, even as he moved from Italy back to American productions later in his career. The personal side of Van Cleef's life. Lee Van Cleef's personal life was as complicated and transformative as his career. He married his first wife, Patty Ruth Kay, in 1943 during the tumult of World War II. At that time, Van Cleef was still a young man trying to make his way in the world, long before his tough guy persona took hold in Hollywood. Their marriage, marked by the demands of military service and a growing family, was a time of great responsibility. Together, they had 3 children, and Van Cleef worked tirelessly in small, often uncredited roles to provide for his family. However, after 15 years, the pressures of ambition, financial uncertainty, and an unpredictable career caused the marriage to dissolve in 1958. Despite the divorce, they remained connected through their children, a second marriage, and new beginnings. After his first marriage ended, Lee Van Cleef married Joan Marjorie Draw in 1960. This second marriage unfolded during a period of transition in Van Cleef's life. While his career was still in the process of rebuilding, he had begun to find his footing, particularly in Italian cinema. Draw stood by him during these years of hard work and persistence. When Van Cleef worked steadily in television and films, often playing villains or morally ambiguous figures. The marriage lasted for over a decade, but ended in divorce in 1974. This period also coincided with Van Cleef's rising fame in Europe, thanks to his successful collaborations with Sergio Leone. His career in Italy had propelled him to international recognition, and he was becoming a star in his own right. The third marriage and stability. In 1976, after years of struggling to find lasting personal happiness, Lee Van Cleef married Barbara Havalone. This third marriage provided the stability he had long sought. By this time, his career had reached a new level of respect and recognition, particularly for his performances in spaghetti westerns and action films. Van Cleef's marriage to Havalone marked a period of relative tranquility in his life. Together, they weathered the challenges of his career and later, his declining health. Barbara was by his side throughout his final years, offering companionship and support as he faced illness. Their bond was one of enduring love and mutual respect, a testament to the sense of stability that had eluded Van Cleef in earlier years. Van Cleef reflects on Clint Eastwood. Late in his career, Lee Van Cleef finally spoke candidly about Clint Eastwood, the man most closely associated with his legacy. Van Cleef acknowledged that many had assumed he and Eastwood were rivals, but he clarified that their relationship was far simpler. "We were 2 men doing our jobs," he said, recognizing that Eastwood's rise to fame had been rapid, partly because of his unique ability to command attention with minimal effort. Eastwood's quiet, restrained approach to acting became his trademark. Van Cleef admired this quality, noting that Eastwood's understanding of the power of stillness made him an unforgettable screen presence. However, Van Cleef also noted the differences between them. While Eastwood embodied the clean, heroic figure, Van Cleef was often cast as the dangerous, morally ambiguous man, a role that suited his sharp features and intense gaze. Lee Van Cleef's death and legacy. Lee Van Cleef passed away on December 16, 1989, at the age of 64, following a heart attack. His death marked the end of a remarkable career in cinema. Even as his body betrayed him, Van Cleef continued to act, proving that his spirit was as indomitable as the characters he portrayed. He was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood, a fitting resting place for an actor who had become a true icon. On his grave marker, the words, "Best of the Bad," are etched, capturing the essence of his legacy as one of Hollywood's greatest character actors. Van Cleef's portrayal of villains, outlaws, and anti-heroes elevated those roles, giving them depth and complexity that made them unforgettable.